the weight of applause. The day after that rehearsal, the MGM lot felt different, though no one could have explained why. The air was still warm with California sun. The sound stages still hummed with the familiar orchestra of production, directors barking instructions, carpenters hammering flats into place. The distant echo of dialogue carried through thin studio walls. But something intangible had shifted between two men who had walked in as adversaries and left as reluctant mirrors. Neither Dean Martin nor Fred Astaire mentioned what had happened in that rehearsal room. They did not refer to the confession, the vulnerability, the fragile honesty that had surfaced like something long buried. But it lingered in the space between them, quiet and undeniable. Fred arrived earlier than usual that morning, as he always did. But he did not begin drilling steps into the floor with the rigid precision that defined him. Instead, he stood alone in the rehearsal studio, staring at his reflection in the wall-length mirror. He had always trusted mirrors. Mirrors told the truth. They reflected flaws without sentiment, hesitation without mercy. But now, as he studied the lines etched deeper into his face, the faint tremor in his left hand that came and went depending on fatigue, he wondered whether mirrors only showed surfaces. They could measure posture, alignment, timing, but they could not measure fear. They could not reveal why a man needed to be flawless in the first place. Dean arrived 15 minutes late, which for him was almost punctual. He walked in with a coffee in one hand and that easy, unbothered stride that had infuriated Fred for weeks. And yet something subtle had changed. He did not toss off a joke. He did not offer a lazy grin. He simply placed the coffee on the piano and met Fred's eyes without armor. It was a small thing, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but Fred noticed. The indifference that had once felt like defiance now seemed more like caution, as if Dean were walking across ice that might crack beneath him if he stepped too hard. They began the routine again. This time Fred did not stop the music at the first imperfect turn. He let it run. Dean moved through the choreography not with theatrical polish, but with presence. There were still technical flaws. His heel placement wasn't as crisp as Fred would have demanded a week earlier. His arms lacked the deliberate elegance Fred had spent a lifetime refining. But there was something else now. Something warmer, more human. Dean was no longer protecting himself from the dance. He was allowing himself to be seen inside it. Fred felt a strange sensation in his chest as he watched. It was not pride exactly. It was closer to recognition. He realized with a quiet shock that he had spent decades believing excellence required severity, that discipline had to come wrapped in criticism, that the only way to elevate someone was to tear down what fell short. Yet here stood Dean Martin, improving not because he had been shamed into it, but because he had been understood. When the music ended, Fred did not clap. He did not praise. He simply nodded once and said, "Again." But his voice carried no edge. Over the next several days, a new rhythm developed between them. Fred still corrected details, but his corrections softened. I shaped more like invitations than accusations. Dean still carried himself with that unhurried cool, but he no longer hid behind it. He asked questions. He requested clarification on transitions. He admitted when something felt unnatural. The studio pianist, who had witnessed their earlier clashes, began to relax. Even the crew sensed the change. There was less tension in the room, less brittle silence between takes. One afternoon, as they rested between rehearsals, Fred found himself speaking before he could stop himself. He told Dean about the first time he had danced on vaudeville stages as a child beside his sister Adele. He described the relentless travel, the pressure to outshine every act that came before them, the constant whisper that one mistake could mean obscurity. "You learn very young," Fred said quietly. That applause isn't guaranteed. It has to be earned every single time." Dean listened without interruption. When Fred finished, Dean nodded slowly and said, "You and I learned the same lesson, just from opposite ends." Fred frowned slightly. "How do you mean?" "You learned that if you don't give everything, you lose the applause. I learned that if you give everything and they still don't clap, it hurts worse. So I stopped giving everything." The simplicity of it struck Fred harder than any argument they had shared. It wasn't laziness that had shaped Dean. It was risk management. It was emotional self-preservation. And Fred, for the first time, understood that his own perfectionism was simply a different form of the same fear. The dance sequence, when finally filmed, carried that transformation within it. It was not the most technically dazzling routine Fred had ever choreographed. Critics would later call it charming, understated, natural. But what they did not see was what it represented. Two philosophies colliding and softening, two men adjusting their armor without fully removing it. After filming wrapped one evening, Fred lingered in the studio long after the crew had gone home. He stood once more before the mirror, but this time he did not search for flaws. He watched himself breathe. He allowed the small imperfections in posture to exist without correction. It felt unsettling at first, like neglect, but beneath that discomfort was something unfamiliar: relief. Across town, Dean sat alone in his dressing room long after he was needed. He replayed the routine in his mind, not to criticize, but to acknowledge. He had tried, fully, and the world had not collapsed. No one had laughed. No one had confirmed his father's quiet prophecy that he would never be enough. The vulnerability had not destroyed him. It had simply made the work richer. Neither man would speak publicly about the shift that occurred during that production. They would move on to other projects, other roles, other versions of themselves. But something had changed permanently. Fred began to loosen his grip on flawlessness. Dean began cautiously to test the boundaries of effort without retreating into indifference. The world would never see the rehearsal room where two legends quietly dismantled pieces of their defenses. But it would see the result in subtler ways, in a softness around Fred's later interviews, and in a quiet steadiness in Dean's performances that felt less like charm and more like presence. They had not transformed each other completely. That is not how people change. Change is incremental, often invisible. But they had nudged each other just enough to alter the trajectory of their private lives. And sometimes that is the most powerful kind of impact, when no one applauds it, when no headline records it, when it exists only between two men standing in a rehearsal studio choosing, just once, not to hide. What remains when the music fades? The months after filming wrapped did not bring dramatic transformations, public declarations, or visible reinventions. Neither Dean Martin nor Fred Astaire became different men overnight. The world did not witness a sudden collapse of perfectionism or a flamboyant embrace of vulnerability. A real change rarely arrives like that. Instead, it settles quietly into habits, into tone, into the small decisions that accumulate over time until a life begins to tilt in a new direction. What had shifted between them during those rehearsals did not demand spectacle. It demanded awareness. Fred returned to his own projects with the same discipline that had defined him for decades, yet something in his rehearsals softened. Assistants who had once braced for sharp corrections noticed a pause before criticism now. There were moments when Fred would allow a sequence to run to completion before intervening, even if he spotted flaws early. He began asking dancers what felt natural rather than dictating every intention. This subtle shift did not diminish the quality of his work. If anything, it expanded it. And there was a warmth creeping into the performances he shaped, a breath between movements that had not existed before. Perfection was no longer the sole objective. There was room now for humanity inside the precision. He would not have admitted it aloud, but he found himself replaying Dean's words more often than he expected. Presence is the goal. It unsettled him. Not because it contradicted his beliefs, but because it exposed how little space he had ever given himself to simply exist within his success. Fred had built a cathedral of discipline around his career. Every brick laid carefully, every angle measured, but he had rarely stopped to stand inside it and feel the echo of applause without immediately planning the next improvement. And the rehearsal room with Dean had forced him to confront a question he had avoided for most of his life. When does striving become self-erasure? Dean, on the other hand, carried the shift differently. He did not suddenly become intense or obsessive. He did not begin arriving hours early or abandoning his casual persona. That would have been inauthentic, a betrayal of the equilibrium he had built to survive. But there were moments, particularly in quieter scenes, where something deeper surfaced. Directors who had worked with him for years began noticing it. He lingered slightly longer before delivering a line. He listened more closely during emotional exchanges. The effortless charm remained, but it no longer felt like armor alone. It felt inhabited. One evening, during a television taping, Dean found himself standing alone behind the curtain as the band finished an introduction. The audience beyond the velvet drape roared with anticipation, the same kind of applause he had heard countless times before. Usually, he would have stepped into that spotlight with an almost detached ease, letting the persona take over like a well-practiced routine. But that night, he paused. He allowed himself to feel the weight of the sound, not analyze it, not deflect it with irony. Just feel it. The applause did not threaten him. It did not demand perfection. It simply existed. And for the first time in a long while, he felt present inside it, rather than floating above it. The shift did not make him fragile. It made him steadier. Years passed. Careers evolved. Fred aged gracefully into a quieter chapter of life, and his body no longer capable of the same athleticism, but still carrying the elegance of decades of discipline. Dean continued to balance music, film, and television, cultivating the legend of ease that audiences adored. To the outside world, their encounter had been a minor professional collaboration, nothing more. But beneath the surface, each carried a trace of the other. Fred began turning down projects that demanded exhaustive rehearsal schedules, not out of laziness, but out of choice. He discovered that excellence did not diminish when he allowed himself rest. He attended family gatherings more often. He lingered at dinner tables instead of leaving early to revise choreography in his head. The world did not collapse. His legacy did not erode. If anything, his later interviews revealed a gentler tone, and a man less guarded by relentless expectation. Dean, too, made small recalibrations. He began practicing musical numbers a little more deliberately before recording sessions, not to chase perfection, but to honor the craft without fearing exposure. When younger performers sought his advice, he no longer brushed them off with humor alone. He spoke about fear. He spoke about survival strategies. He admitted carefully that effort was not weakness, that trying did not automatically invite humiliation. The young artists who listened did not see the vulnerability beneath those words, but it was there. The memory of that rehearsal room never became a story they shared publicly. It did not need to be mythologized. It was too intimate for that. Instead, it functioned like a quiet compass inside both men. When Fred felt the old tightening in his chest before a performance, he remembered the dance that was imperfect but alive. When Dean felt the impulse to retreat into indifference, he remembered the moment he had stepped fully into movement and survived it. Time, as it always does, continued its steady march. Fred's body slowed further. Dean's world grew quieter in later years, his retreat from public life becoming more pronounced. Success, fame, applause, these things fade in volume eventually. What remains is memory and the reckoning that comes with it. In private moments, each man reflected on the cost of the strategies that had once protected them. Fred, in the twilight of his life, once remarked to a close friend that the greatest lesson he had learned did not come from Broadway stages or Hollywood sets, no, but from a rehearsal studio where someone he had initially judged refused to fight back with ego. He did not name Dean explicitly in that conversation, but the implication was clear. It was not the technical brilliance that reshaped him. It was the honesty. Dean, in his later years, would sit alone with a drink in hand, watching old recordings flicker across a screen. Sometimes he would pause at the dance sequence that had once felt like confrontation. He would study the younger version of himself, noticing the tension in his shoulders and the flicker of courage in his eyes. He did not critique it. He did not dismiss it. He simply acknowledged it as a moment when he chose not to hide. Both men understood something by the end of their lives that few articulate clearly. Strength is not singular. It does not reside only in discipline or only in ease. It does not belong exclusively to those who strive relentlessly or those who glide effortlessly. True strength lies in the willingness to examine the walls we build and decide which ones still serve us. Their encounter had not erased fear. Fear is stubborn, but it had redefined its influence. It had shown them that survival strategies forged in childhood do not have to govern adulthood forever. That perfection and indifference are both shields, and sometimes the bravest act is setting the shield down, even briefly. The world would remember Fred Astaire as the embodiment of grace, the man who danced as if gravity itself had agreed to cooperate. It would remember Dean Martin as the king of cool, the man who made effort look unnecessary. But beneath those public images were two human beings who once stood in a rehearsal studio and recognized themselves in each other's defenses. And what remained when the music faded was not rivalry. It was understanding. The last dance we never see. There is a strange quiet that settles over a life once the spotlight dims. It is not sadness exactly, nor is it regret. It is something more reflective, a kind of spaciousness where memory has room to breathe. For men like Dean Martin and Fred Astaire, whose lives had been defined by stages, studios, applause, and expectation, that quiet arrived gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. The invitations grew fewer. The rehearsals shortened, the audiences aged, and in that slowing, something more important than performance began to surface. Fred Astaire, long after he had stopped dancing professionally, would still rise early. Habit is difficult to abandon when it has shaped the architecture of your life. He would stretch carefully, aware now of joints that had once obeyed without complaint. There were mornings when he would step lightly across the floor of his home, testing small sequences not out of obligation, but out of memory. These private dances were no longer about execution. They were about feeling the echo of who he had been. The mirror did not reflect the same effortless figure from decades past, yet he did not flinch from it. He had come to understand something essential. Perfection was a moment in time, but presence could exist at any age. In those later years, Fred's conversations shifted tone. His interviewers who expected meticulous breakdowns of technique instead encountered a gentler philosophy. He spoke about collaboration more than control. He spoke about listening. On one occasion, when asked what the greatest lesson of his career had been, he paused longer than usual. The room waited for an answer about discipline or rehearsal. Instead, he said quietly that the greatest lesson had been learning when to let go. He did not elaborate. He did not need to. Those who had known him in earlier decades understood how radical that statement was. Dean Martin's retreat into later life unfolded differently. Where Fred had always been publicly disciplined, Dean had always projected ease. As he withdrew from public performance, the myth of effortlessness remained attached to him. Yet those closest to him noticed that his silences carried more weight. He watched more than he spoke. He laughed less frequently, but when he did, it felt grounded rather than deflective. The armor had not vanished, but it had softened at the edges. Time has a way of sanding down even the most polished defenses. Occasionally, when old film reels played in the background of his den, Dean would linger on scenes that once seemed trivial. A particular turn of movement, a glance exchanged mid-dance, a beat of hesitation before a line delivery. He began to appreciate moments he once dismissed as simply part of the job. They were evidence of something deeper, moments where he had risked being present instead of merely charming. He did not speak publicly about those reflections. Dean was never one to narrate his own emotional evolution, but inside, there was acknowledgement. Years before his passing, Fred once attended a small, private gathering of industry veterans. Conversation drifted toward collaborations that had surprised them, partnerships that had altered the way they approached their craft. Someone mentioned Dean Martin casually, expecting perhaps a polite anecdote. Instead, Fred grew thoughtful. He described a rehearsal from long ago, without dramatics, without embellishment. He said that sometimes the most important performances are not the ones the audience sees, but the ones that occur between two people when pride is set aside. The room grew still. Those who understood, understood. Dean, too, would occasionally respond when asked about dance or discipline. He would shrug in that familiar way, but there was a softness behind it. Once, during a quiet exchange with a young performer struggling under the weight of expectation, Dean said that trying does not make you weak. He did not explain where that realization had come from. He simply offered it as fact. The young performer never knew that the sentence had roots in a studio confrontation decades earlier. As the years narrowed and health began its inevitable decline for both men, memory sharpened in unexpected ways. Fred, reflecting on his life's work, realized that the applause had never truly been about technical perfection. Audiences remembered how they felt watching him, not how flawlessly he executed each sequence. The connection had always mattered more than the calculation. He allowed himself to feel pride without immediately scanning for flaws. It was a small but profound shift. But for a man who had spent a lifetime adjusting angles and counts, acceptance was its own final choreography. Dean, in the final chapters of his life, wrestled quietly with loneliness, as many performers do once the noise fades. Yet he did not retreat entirely into detachment. There were moments of genuine gratitude that surfaced when he least expected them. Gratitude not for fame, but for the handful of encounters that had altered him internally. He understood perhaps more clearly than ever that success built on avoidance leaves hollow spaces. But success infused with presence, even briefly, leaves something solid behind. When Fred Astaire passed, the world mourned a legend. Tributes focused on innovation, elegance, unmatched skill. The narrative was clean and celebratory. The few spoke about the internal battles that had driven his discipline. Few understood how deeply fear of imperfection had once fueled his genius. Yet in the privacy of his later reflections, he had come to peace with that tension. He had learned that excellence without self-compassion is incomplete. When Dean Martin died years later, tributes celebrated charm, wit, musicality, that iconic cool. The mythology of nonchalance endured, but those who had watched him closely recognized something more complicated beneath it. They remembered flashes of vulnerability that surfaced rarely but sincerely. They remembered the rare moments when he let the audience see that effort and fear could coexist with style. The world never witnessed a public reconciliation scene between these two men because none was necessary. There was no dramatic apology tour, no grand joint interview dissecting the lessons of a rehearsal long past. Their transformation did not require spectacle. It required understanding, and understanding, once achieved, does not need advertisement. What endures is not the technical brilliance alone, nor the effortless charisma alone. What endures is the recognition that both men confronted the same truth from opposite directions. One feared imperfection, the other feared exposure. One hid inside discipline, The other hid inside indifference. In meeting each other honestly, they discovered that the armor itself was not the enemy. It was simply outdated protection. The real work was choosing when to lower it. In the end, the most significant dance between Dean Martin and Fred Astaire was not choreographed. It did not involve music or marks or rehearsals. It was the subtle exchange of perspective, the quiet dismantling of assumptions, the shared acknowledgement that fear had shaped them both. That invisible dance altered their steps long after the rehearsal ended. There is something deeply human about that realization. We often believe growth requires dramatic confrontation, sweeping transformation, visible reinvention. More often, it is born from a single conversation that rearranges how we see ourselves. A moment where judgment gives way to curiosity. A moment where pride loosens just enough for honesty to enter. Fred Astaire remained Fred Astaire. Dean Martin remained Dean Martin. Their public identities did not dissolve. But beneath the legends lived two men who, for one afternoon in a quiet studio, had allowed themselves to see past performance, and in doing so, they taught each other something neither applause nor perfection could provide. When the music fades, what remains is not the choreography. It is the courage to stand still without fear. And sometimes, that is the greatest dance of all.